They say blood is thicker than water, but in my family, blood was just an excuse for betrayal. I am standing on the balcony of my studio in Maine, listening to the ocean breeze. It is quiet here, a striking contrast to the suffocating opulence of the Hamptons estate I left behind. My cousin Victoria thought she had orchestrated the perfect deception to strip me of everything. But she underestimated the one man who saw through her polished mask. The storm is over now, and the wreckage she created buried her alive. Looking back, I realized the foundation for this betrayal was laid decades ago. The memory of my childhood in the Hamptons estate still carries a distinct chill. It was a sprawling, magnificent property with manicured lawns and endless corridors. On the outside, it was the picture of elite perfection, but inside it felt like a museum where nothing was allowed to be touched. Least of all me. My uncle Marcus, the patriarch and a titan of real estate, brought me into that house after I was left orphaned. He was a towering, formidable man who spoke very little, yet his quiet presence was the only anchor I had. A silent nod from him across the drawing room, or a rare, brief hand on my shoulder, meant the world to me. He was fair and he saw everything. But when he was out building his empire, the house belonged to my Aunt Beatrice and my cousin Victoria. Beatrice was a woman consumed by appearances. Her life was a parade of charity galas and country club luncheons. To her, I was an uncomfortable obligation, a secret blemish on her perfectly curated life. She never yelled, but her cold, sweeping glances and the way she tightened her lips when I entered a room spoke volumes. And then there was Victoria. She was the undisputed center of that universe, groomed for absolute entitlement. Victoria was loud, demanding, and thrived on the power she held over everyone. She lived in a world of luxury and designer brands, completely disconnected from reality. While she was praised for merely existing, I made myself invisible. I spent my days sketching in the library, earning my architecture degree, trying desperately to stay out of the way. I thought if I stayed quiet, if I asked for nothing, they would eventually just let me be. But my silence only fueled Victoria's resentment. To her, I was a parasite, an unwanted guest occupying space that belonged to her. The true depth of her cruelty culminated on the evening of my 25th birthday. Uncle Marcus was away in Europe for business, leaving the three of us alone in the grand dining room. The house felt unusually hollow. The crystal chandelier cast a harsh light over the long, polished mahogany table. There was no cake, no warm wishes, just the oppressive scraping of silverware. Beatrice was pouring herself glass after glass of expensive wine, her eyes fixed on the wall. Halfway through the excruciating meal, Victoria leaned back in her heavily upholstered chair. A slow, venomous smirk spread across her face. She reached into her pocket and casually tossed an object across the table. It slid across the smooth wood and stopped right next to my plate. I looked down. It was a key. But not just any key. It was heavy, covered in thick rust with jagged, worn edges. I looked up at her, my heart pounding. She let out a sharp, mocking laugh. She told me it was the key to the abandoned maintenance shed down by the cliffs. She said I should start moving my things there because it was time I learned my place in the world. She told me the charity run was over, and that parasites don't get to live in the main house forever. Beatrice didn't flinch. She just took another slow sip of her wine, her silence an absolute endorsement of the humiliation. I gripped that freezing, rusted metal in my palm, my vision blurring with hot tears. We are all trapped in this massive societal delusion. The belief that blood is thicker than water. But psychology proves the exact opposite. Blood only provides a genetic code. It does not automatically generate compassion, loyalty, or human decency. In that dining room, the people who shared my family name, the ones connected to me by a bloodline, were the ones actively crushing my spirit out of sheer greed. Conversely, Uncle Marcus, a man who had no biological obligation to me, was the only one who showed me the true meaning of family. The concept of a chosen family isn't just a modern trend, it is a survival mechanism. Whoever treats you with genuine respect, that is the person who deserves a seat at your table. Blood does not grant anyone the supreme privilege to abuse you. I didn't throw the key back at her. Kept it, not because she made me feel worthless, but because I needed a physical reminder of the monsters I was living with. Little did Victoria know, that rusty key would eventually unlock the absolute destruction of her own empire. The news of Uncle Marcus passing away came without warning, hitting like a violent tremor that cracked the very foundation of the estate. The days that followed were a suffocating blur of cold formalities, dark suits, and rehearsed grief. But the real storm, the one that would tear the facade of this family apart, was waiting for us at the law firm. I remember that freezing morning in Manhattan like a photograph burned into my mind. The air inside the executive boardroom of his legal team was thick with a metallic tension. It was a massive, intimidating space. Floor-to-ceiling glass windows offered a dizzying view of the city skyline, a city my uncle had helped build. The dark mahogany table felt endless. I sat quietly near the corner, my hands folded in my lap, trying to steady my breathing. Aunt Beatrice arrived first. She was draped in black designer couture, her face perfectly powdered, dabbing at dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. She didn't even look my way. She just took her seat, staring blankly at the polished wood. And then, Victoria made her entrance. She didn't just walk into the room, she paraded. Her sharp heels clicked aggressively against the marble floor, announcing her arrival like a conquering queen. She wasn't dressed in mourning clothes. She wore a sharp, tailored crimson suit, looking more like she was arriving for a corporate takeover. She was flanked by 3 high-priced, aggressive-looking attorneys carrying thick briefcases. She looked over at me, her lips curling into a tight, venomous smirk. She dropped her heavy handbag onto the table with a loud, deliberate thud, then leaned over to whisper something to her lead counsel. They both let out a soft, mocking laugh. She was absolutely certain the empire was already hers. To her, this meeting was just a tedious formality, the final step before she legally erased my existence from the family tree and threw me out onto the street. Finally, Mr. Vance, my uncle's most trusted attorney, entered the room. He carried a heavy, locked leather portfolio. He looked incredibly serious, his eyes carrying the heavy weight of a dead man's final wishes. He took his place at the head of the table, looking at each of us. He stated that Marcus had left explicit, unalterable instructions for this specific hour, and that he had anticipated every possible complication. Victoria leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with unfiltered greed, waiting to be crowned. Mr. Vance broke the heavy seal on the portfolio. The agonizing silence in the room deepened, pressing against my chest. He began to read, his steady voice echoing against the cold glass walls. I, Marcus, being of sound mind, declare this my final will and testament. He started with the minor distributions. A few secondary properties and an annual stipend were allocated to Beatrice. A standard, heavily regulated trust fund was set aside for Victoria. Victoria's triumphant posture stiffened. Her smug smile vanished instantly. She darted a furious look at her lawyers, her brow furrowing in confusion. This wasn't the absolute control she had been waiting for. Then Mr. Vance turned a crisp page, letting out a slow breath before delivering the final blow. As for the controlling interest of my global real estate holdings, the remaining 80% of my liquid assets, and my permanent seat as chairman of the board of directors, I leave entirely and without condition to my niece, Evelyn. The room stopped breathing. The silence was so absolute I could hear the faint hum of traffic miles below us. My own heart pounded so hard it ached. Chairman of the board. He didn't just leave me money, he left me his legacy. Then, the room exploded. Victoria slammed both her hands onto the glass table, shooting up from her expensive leather chair. That is a lie, she screamed, her face twisting into a mask of pure, ugly rage. Read it again. She is a charity case. She is a pathetic orphan. She has absolutely no blood right to this company. Her lead attorney scrambled, frantically pulling legal pads from his briefcase, trying to intervene. Mr. Vance simply raised his hand, his expression entirely unmoved by her outburst. He calmly asked her to sit down, stating that the document was notarized, witnessed, and absolutely ironclad. But Victoria was practically shaking with fury. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. She manipulated him. She played the quiet, innocent victim while I was the one who belonged in this lifestyle. I will contest this. I will tie this estate up in litigation for the next 20 years, and you will get nothing. Beatrice gasped, finally showing a crack in her perfect, icy facade, pulling at Victoria's sleeve to quiet her down. I sat perfectly still. I didn't gloat. I didn't argue back. I just watched the woman who had tormented me my entire life unravel in a matter of seconds. But Mr. Vance wasn't finished. He closed the main folder. He looked at Victoria with a chilling, calculated calmness. "I strongly advise against a contest, Victoria," he said quietly. "There is more." Mr. Vance reached down into the dark depths of his leather portfolio. He pulled out a small, heavy steel lockbox and placed it on the glass table. The dull thud made Victoria flinch. He produced a small brass key, unlocked the lid, and slowly pulled out a thick stack of financial records, wire transfer receipts, and forensic accounting reports. He looked directly at Victoria. His voice dropped to a terrifyingly calm whisper. He explained that 10 months ago, Uncle Marcus had noticed severe discrepancies in the family's primary charitable foundation. Instead of asking questions or causing a scene, he had ordered a quiet, independent audit. The documents sitting on that table were undeniable, unassailable proof. Over the course of a year, Victoria had forged her uncle's signature, systematically siphoning over $1 million from a fund meant for underprivileged children, all to quietly cover her mounting personal debts and fund her lavish, fabricated lifestyle. Victoria's face turned the color of wet ash. Her mouth opened but no words came out. Her lead attorney slowly pulled his hands off the table, looking down at the forged signatures, physically distancing himself from his own client. "Do you know what the most terrifying punishment in human psychology is? It is not a violent fit of rage. It is a silent observer." When my uncle realized the absolute depth of her betrayal, he didn't yell. He didn't confront her or demand tearful apologies. He simply watched her. He quietly hired investigators, gathered every single piece of evidence, and wove a perfect, inescapable legal net from behind the scenes. Toxic manipulators always think they are the smartest people in the room when they sneak behind your back. But they forget one crucial reality. The silence of a calm, grounded person is never an act of stupidity. It is them quietly measuring the absolute limits of your morality. And once their patience finally runs out, the verdict they deliver is permanent and completely irreversible. Victoria finally found her voice, her hands shaking violently against the edge of the table. She stammered that it was just a misunderstanding, a temporary loan she was planning to pay back. Mr. Vance didn't even blink. He simply turned to the final page of the will, preparing to read the most devastating clause Uncle Marcus had ever drafted. As the new chairman of the board, I wasn't just handed the keys to the empire. The document explicitly appointed me as the sole, absolute trustee of Victoria's personal trust fund. I held complete discretionary control over every single cent she would ever receive for the rest of her natural life. She would have to submit expense requests to me, the same girl she had thrown a rusty key at. But the true chilling brilliance of my uncle's trap lay in the final stipulation. Mr. Vance adjusted his glasses and looked directly at her high-priced legal team. He stated that the will contained a strict, heavily fortified no-contest clause. If Victoria or anyone acting on her behalf attempted to challenge my inheritance in any court of law, a sealed duplicate file containing the complete forensic evidence of her million-dollar federal fraud would be immediately and automatically handed over to the FBI. The trap had snapped shut. She was completely cornered. She could either live the rest of her life on a strict allowance, entirely at the mercy of the orphan she had ruthlessly abused, or she could try to fight me and spend the next decade in a federal prison. The heavy, suffocating arrogance that had defined her entire existence just evaporated. Victoria physically collapsed back into her heavy leather chair. She wrapped her arms around her stomach, breathing in shallow, panicked gasps, her trembling hands unable to hide the sheer terror on her face. Beside her, Aunt Beatrice buried her face in her silk handkerchief, sobbing uncontrollably, finally realizing that their golden, untouchable empire was gone forever. As the lawyers silently packed away their heavy briefcases, the suffocating reality of the room finally settled in. Victoria was still slumped in her leather chair, staring blankly at the floor, completely broken. Then Aunt Beatrice stumbled toward me. Her perfect, manicured facade was completely shattered. She reached out, her hands trembling violently, and grabbed my arm. She wept, her voice cracking as she pleaded with me to be reasonable. She begged me to have mercy, to remember that we were all family, and that Victoria was simply desperate and misguided. She promised things would be different now, that we could finally be a real family. I looked down at her fingers digging into my sleeve. I didn't yell. I didn't pull away in anger. I felt nothing but a profound, hollow exhaustion. I reached into my bag and pulled out the heavy rusted key. The exact same key Victoria had thrown at my plate on my 25th birthday. I pressed the freezing metal gently into Beatrice's trembling palm. I looked her directly in the eyes and told her that the maintenance shed by the cliffs was still empty, and they were more than welcome to move their things there. Beatrice gasped, pulling her hand back as if the rusted metal had physically burned her. Many people believe that a true happy ending requires a tearful reconciliation, a desperate, emotional embrace to mend a shattered family. But the reality of healing reveals a much sharper truth. Personal boundaries are infinitely more important than maintaining toxic attachments. When I turned my back on them, I wasn't holding on to vengeance. I was finally exercising my fundamental right to emotional freedom. We have absolutely no obligation to repair a relationship that constantly corrodes our spirit, no matter how much history or blood we share. Society often demands that we forgive and forget, but true forgiveness does not mean you have to continue enabling their abuse. Walking away is never an act of cowardice. It is the ultimate, most courageous way to protect the most intact, peaceful version of yourself. I turned around and walked out of that cold glass boardroom, leaving them trapped in the wreckage of their own greed. That rusted antique key was once a devastating symbol of my humiliation. Now it had unlocked the door to my absolute power, and I chose to use it to lock my past away once and for all. Now I am standing by the large glass window of my own architectural studio here in Maine. The ocean breeze outside is sharp and cold, but it feels incredibly clean. I trace the lines of a new blueprint on my desk. It is a life I built entirely with my own hands, far away from the suffocating shadows of the Hamptons estate. I left the day-to-day operations of the company to a trusted board of directors. I didn't need to sit in that dark mahogany room to prove my worth. People often assume that staying quiet makes you an easy target. But silence isn't always surrender. Sometimes it is simply the sound of someone quietly gathering the strength to survive. My uncle taught me that true power never needs to shout to be heard. And Victoria, she taught me that the most inescapable prisons are the ones we build for ourselves out of sheer greed. Some endings do not require a dramatic apology or a tearful embrace. Sometimes the most powerful closure is simply walking away and refusing to look back. The long bitter storm is finally over, and the quiet out here is absolutely perfect.